I wanted to start today with a piece of art. And many of you probably know the artist. Van Gogh. Yeah, it's a very famous piece. And I have always loved talking about art in terms of art history, art appreciation. But I confess that I was once one of those people that said, I'm not an artist. Like, if you want me to draw stick figures, I'm your girl, but otherwise, I'm not an artist. And I've come to realize over the years that that is no different than when our students tell us, I'm not a math person, or, I just can't do fill in the blank. And we know those thoughts are not true. We tell our students, no, you can do this. And so I realized that when I was homeschooling my kids, that it would not work for me to tell them, you can do this. You are able to do this, but your mama can't, because, I'm not an art person. I just realized, you know what, I can't say it to myself. And as we go today into logic and rhetoric, especially for those of you who are teaching at the preschool or the elementary levels, when you catch yourself saying, but I can't do, the logic and rhetoric, the formal stuff. Yes, you can. You can. Now, it doesn't mean it's just going to come to you by osmosis. You can't just sleep with it under your pillow at night and it happens. It takes work, but you can do it. And so I, as an adult with no art classes, I didn't take art my whole life long. We got some kind of directions on how to do art, how to teach art, how to learn how to do art, and that's my art. Now, it's never going to hang in a museum, right? But I'm super proud of it because it looks like what it's supposed to look like. And what I love even more is that as I'm sitting there doing art with my 5-year-old and my 7-year-old, that's their art. So modeling after the greats, we also are employing, and learning about the techniques and about the difficulties of working with the mediums and so forth. So my point on this was just kind of an object lesson of never tell yourself you can't either on all of this. No, we haven't learned all of this. We probably, most of us weren't exposed to all of the works of Plato and Cicero and Aristotle and so forth. But we can do this. We can continue to cultivate within ourselves a classically educated person. Okay, so now with that, I will leave this up for a little bit, but as you can see, I'm going to run into it in a minute. So these are the 6 comma rules, by the way, that you guys were asking about yesterday. So let me go through these really quickly, and then we'll jump into dialectic level. Introductory elements. Anytime a word, phrase, or clause comes to the beginning of the sentence. So yesterday, comma, I went to the store. In the morning, comma, I went to the store. After I had bought a loaf of bread, comma, I went back to the store. Okay. Lists would be in series. This is things like, at the store, comma, I bought eggs, comma, milk, comma, and bread. That last comma before and is called the Oxford comma. It's been big in debates in English circles, and sometimes it just trickles into comedy shows and sitcoms and everything. Here's the thing about the comma rule I tell my students about the Oxford comma. It has never, in all of its debate, been wrong to use it. There are times when a panda eats shoots and leaves where you really need it in order to understand what is going on in the sentence. And since it's never been wrong, and I love to give my students as few exceptions to English as possible, we use it for that reason. Not because you have to, because it's never wrong to use it, and it can create confusion if you don't. Okay, so third, a positive phrase is an interruption. That's like, Mrs. Mildred, comma, my teacher, comma, makes us learn 6 comma rules. Non-essential DCs, here's where they have to know what a DC is, which we already talked about, okay, but here's another reason why. So if it's non-essential, this one's so much fun to teach kids, especially high schoolers. Usually I like to use the example so that it's not super violent. Hangs them by their shoestrings from the ceiling. I like to use kind of that sort of thing. So if you say, students who misbehave will be hung from the ceiling by their shoestrings. okay? Students who misbehave will be hung by their shoestrings from the ceilings. The question is, do you put a comma around who misbehave? Do you or don't you? So the commas always mean that it's not essential, so that you can take it out. It's almost like those commas can lift it right out of there. Now, if you lift it right out of there, what does the sentence say? Students, every single one of them, should be hung from the ceiling by their shoestrings. And of course, all the kids are like, no, we don't want that. So that is not a non-essential IC, okay? But it goes around non-essentials. 2 ICs, we talked about that, what that is, joined by coordinating conjunctions, okay? Which in my classes, my kids all memorize the 7 coordinating conjunctions. There are only 7 of them. So if you have an IC coordinating conjunction, another IC, you put a comma. These are done all through structure. Hopefully you're seeing that. It's all about sentence structure. So that way the rules are actually grouped together. The 6th one is my miscellaneous category. It includes dates, pauses for effect, other miscellaneous uses of commas like salutations and closings and letters. So there's a bunch of them in the miscellaneous one. And you may think, well, so then it's not really 6 rules. Let me tell you this, of these 6 rules, which rule is the easiest rule for kids? They don't mess up on it. 6. By the time they get to me, they know it's dear so-and-so, comma. They know that it's July 6, comma. They know that if you have this big pause, there has to be a mark of punctuation there. Okay, so this one's easy for them. And then the rest of these, so really they have 5 to learn. So 5 rules instead of whatever we said, 42, 47. Okay. All right, I will leave it up for another couple seconds and then I'm going to have to erase it. So let's talk about moving into dialectic logic level. Initial thoughts to keep in mind. Okay, now. First, observe. Listen to the types of questions students ask you. Pay attention when students notice the exceptions to rules they have learned in their grammar level studies. Pay attention when students ask the question, why? It's really easy, especially if it's like February, and a student says why, to just immediately go into, the eye roll mode. Again, why do we have to learn this? Why do we have, but if it's not a whine why, okay, if it's not a whine, then make sure and pay attention to it, because if they're asking why, that is their brain kind of shifting over and wanting to make those logical connections. Even when students are young, if they are asking why, their brain is making those associations. We would not say that those young children are at or have arrived at the logic level as a developmental level or stage, okay? But these are glimpses to the logic level to come, and for a brief moment, they're flashes of the brain jumping to the dialectic. We read to our children before they can do so themselves, right? We read to them years before they start to learn the skill of reading. We tell them what time it is or how many minutes before bed before they can tell and understand the concept, which is very kind of abstract, of time. We should likewise give our children logic exposure before they reach the logic age. So logic level learning tools. The first one we have is deductive reasoning, inductive reasoning, and argumentation. And just like the grammar, we'll go through each of these in order. Formal logic, material logic, and material fallacies. So I'll talk about the difference between those 2 types of logic, and the Socratic Method, which we already have talked about a little bit. And again, if you didn't get all of these down, these are gonna be our bullet points at the top. So let's talk about the first one. Deductive reasoning, inductive reasoning, and argumentation tips. Yes, we want our kids to argue with us. Teach the 4 conditional statements. Have students practice the relationships between them. Now this, of course, makes us wonder, what are the 4 conditional statements? Okay, and we use these in geometry as well. So the original, when it has rained, notice the comma there, the grass is watered. When it has rained, the grass is watered. That would be an introductory element rule. So the converse of this statement is, when the grass is watered, it has rained. Okay, so we took, usually they're called P and Q. We took P and Q and we just switched them. Now it says Q, comma, P instead of P, comma, Q. Okay? I always teach my kids converse, can, reverse. That way they can remember that. That's what the converse of the statement is. Inverse, we start with the original. We don't worry about this one. It's always in relationship to the original. Inverse of this statement is when it has not rained, then the grass is not watered. So this one in label form would be, if this is P, comma, Q, it would be not P, comma, not Q. So I always teach my students inverse into the negative. The contrapositive of a statement is when the grass of this statement, when the grass is not watered, it has not rained. So notice two things have happened here. We've kind of done the converse and the inverse of it. Do you see that? So if it's P, comma, Q, it's not Q, comma, not P. Now these, you can take very simple statements, and you can do this with students even when they're young. Teach them how to put them into the different orders, and then what's very interesting is which ones are true and which ones are valid. Okay, so you can give the students an original and one of the three other statements and ask them if it's necessarily true. So we say, when it has rained, the grass is watered. Would we agree, first of all, that our original is a truthful statement? Because if you start off with a false statement, then that just gets really confusing. Okay, so then let's look at it. When the grass is watered, you walk out in your grass this morning, oh goodness, it's all wet. It must have rained. Is that necessarily true? No. Okay, so we do the same thing. When it has rained, grass is watered. When it has not rained, the grass is not wet. It says not, the grass was not watered. Is that necessarily true? No, because you could walk out and it still could be watered, right? When it has rained, the grass is watered. When the grass is not watered, it has not rained. Can we say that? When the grass is not watered, in other words, when the grass is dry, we can say that it has not rained. Yes, and as it turns out, the original and contrapositive of the statements are equally truthful. They are basically equivalent of one another. So then you can teach them the difference between a true statement and a valid statement. And you can also teach conditional statements, if this, then this. And kids love saying if-then statements. They do it all the time. If we clean up our rooms, then can we have ice cream? If we do this in 20 minutes, can we have 5 minutes extra recess? They're if-thenning you from the moment they can, right? All right, moving on. Teach the difference between a true statement and a valid statement. Oh, I already did that, sorry. Teach the difference between inductive and deductive reasoning. So let's talk about those two. Inductive reasoning is reasoning in which the premises are viewed as supplying strong evidence for the truth of the conclusion. While the conclusion of a deductive argument is certain, the truth of the conclusion of an inductive argument is probable based on the evidence given. Now that's from Wikipedia, and that is very encyclopedic. Let's just break this down. If it's inductive reasoning, let's do an example over here. All right, let's say she had lunch in the cafeteria, and you had lunch in the cafeteria, and you had lunch in the cafeteria, and you went off campus for lunch. And you got tummy problems right after lunch, and by the way, I loved lunch, so yay for Jennifer Edens, but you got tummy problems right after lunch, and so did you, and so did you, and so did you, and so did you, and you did not. Now this is inductive reasoning. What could we conclude as a probably supplying strong evidence of truth? Probably, what can we assume? There was something bad in the food in the cafeteria. Now, if I then told you that these five sat at one specific table in the gymnasium, and all of these folks also had lunch from the cafeteria, but they sat at a different table, and these five all have tummy problems, and these 7, 8, however many are here don't. Well, now we have more information, and inductively, what can we probably assume? Probably. It's something on the table. Okay, but notice that it's not absolutely 100% true. Okay, deductive is instead like a syllogism, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. Have students create a pro and con list for both deductive and inductive reasoning. This is a logical exercise in itself. When is it good to use deductive reasoning? When is it good to use inductive reasoning? When can using inductive reasoning get us in trouble? When we assume too soon about something. Discuss the limitations right there of inductive reasoning. Find where society uses inductive reasoning but applies it as universal truth. Yeah, aka evolution, right? Okay, although that's not just the simple problem. Another thing I like to do for logic when they're little is to expose your students to logic puzzles. Vary it between the world of words and the world of numbers. Okay, you can have logic puzzles both ways. This is something that children should be exposed to early in life. Very simple logic puzzles can be completed by young children, and in fact, puzzles themselves, just puzzles, are a type of logic puzzle because they challenge children to use the clues of the shapes and the edges to figure out the correct solution. Which piece fits with the next piece? Encourage argumentation in the classical definition of the word. The action or process of reasoning systematically in support of an action, idea, or theory. Give extra credit if they make their case logically would be one way you could do it. Or have them state the reasons behind a rule. Or orally show them how to leap from premise to arguments to a logical conclusion. There's a great book that I would recommend that first you read and then you kind of can expose your children to it depending on their age. It's called Aristotle for Everybody. It's by Mortimer J. Adler. It's a great book to discuss as well. Okay, formal logic tips. Students must study formal logic for several years if they're going to train their minds. The world around us and them has all but abandoned critical thought and drawing logical conclusions from arguments. So formal logic focuses upon the form of the argument. That's why it's called formal. It's not formal meaning it's some sort of like proper or very high. It's formal meaning the form of the logic. So the form of the argument is displayed by representing its sentences in the formal grammar and symbolism of a logical language to make its content usable in formal inference. Simply put, it means translating English sentences into the language of logic. And this is called, when you translate it, it's called the logical form of the argument. It's necessary because indicative sentences of ordinary language show a considerable variety of form and complexity that make its use and inference impractical. It requires first ignoring grammatical features irrelevant to logic, such as gender and declension, if the argument is in Latin, replacing conjunctions, such as but, okay, that doesn't work well in the language of logic, and logical conjunctions, the words like and replacing ambiguous or alternative logical expressions, some of the indefinite pronouns like any, every, etc. So instead of going through the classical syllogism, what I'd like to do, because we just don't have time to do it, is tell you that if it's the syllogism, if it's a form of if this then this, or all this is this, something here, and if it's basically 3 sentences, that is formal logic and a classical syllogism. So if you want to take a look at Traditional Logic 1 and 2 by Martin Cochran from Memoria Press, it's very accessible. They use this, I think, for their 7th and 8th graders. So it's very accessible as an adult to really get a handle on the classical syllogism. Okay, now this is the one where we are probably more familiar with it when we talk about logic. When you hear about logic or people doing logical fallacies, we're talking about material logic. So material logic is also called major logic. Material logic focuses not on the form, not on how we structure it into 3 sentences to draw a valid conclusion, but on its content. In short, while formal logic studies the how of reasoning, material logic studies the what. And formal logic teaches us how to rightly come to a conclusion. But just coming to a conclusion is only half of the goal of reasoning. We also want to come to conclusions that are truthful. So this formal logic focuses on whether it's a valid argument. We also, as we're being valid, okay, we're following all the rules of logic, we also want it to be true and truthful. So material fallacies are arguments that are fallacious for reasons other than their structural flaws. And they usually require examination of the argument's content. And these are often called informal fallacies, which probably many, if not all of you, are familiar with. Wikipedia has a list of 60 such fallacies, which provide free access to definitions and examples. Many of them are named in Latin. Also, other good sources to study material logic and material fallacies are these two sources. The Art of Argument from Classical Academic Press, and Material Logic by Martin Cothran from, it should say Memoria Press. I don't know what happened to Memoria Press. Some of them, just so that you kind of know, I mean, I'm not going to list all 60, but we have like an ad hominem. Okay, that means you are appealing to the man. It's usually an attack, right? You're just saying, well, you can't believe what he says because da 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 da. But sometimes it can be used positively too. Oh, well, I just love him. Well, that doesn't mean that he's right, just because he's a great person. Okay? And then there are others like that. I'm just trying to think of some. Post hoc ergo propter hoc. After this, therefore, because of this. If you say something happened after something else, that first thing caused the second thing, that's an informal fallacy. Okay, so there are things like that you can help your students look at and identify as they are reading things. Okay, next, Socratic Method tips. Elenchus is the central technique of the Socratic Method. How many of you went to Alex Graff's? Okay, he talked extensively about the Elenchus. In Plato's early dialogues, the Elenchus is a technique that Socrates uses to investigate. For example, the nature or definition of ethical concepts. He usually likes to take a word like justice or virtue, and he likes to work with it in a dialogue fashion to help either better define it or to help make fun of the definitions that his character uses that he's arguing against. So Socrates' interlocutor asserts a thesis. For example, courage is endurance of the soul, which sounds so nice and poetic, does it not? Which Socrates, of course, considers false and targets for refutation. Socrates secures his interlocutor's agreement to further premises. For example, would you agree that courage is a fine thing? Would you agree that ignorant endurance is not a fine thing? Socrates then argues, and the interlocutor agrees, that these further premises imply the contrary to the original thesis. In this case, it leads to courage is not the endurance of the soul. So that's kind of how, in any of these dialogues, and these are great, I think, for all of you to just sometime just read, for like leisure reading. Because first of all, they're quite funny. And Socrates has such a way of making whoever he's arguing against, look foolish. And of course, Socrates always wins in these, and so you can kind of start to see if you can guess where he's going before he gets there, and so forth. Socrates then claims that he has shown that his interlocutor's thesis is false and that its negation is true. One eclectic examination can lead to a new, more refined examination of the concept being considered. In this case, it invites an examination of the claim, courage is wise endurance of the soul. So sometimes he doesn't totally make fun of the person he is arguing against, but he just wants to kind of clarify these kind of statements that are a little broad and overgeneralized. Most Socratic inquiries consist of series of elenchi and typically end in puzzlement. where he doesn't really come to any conclusion. Alex Graf talked about that. This is known as aporia. All right, so very similar to this is the mathematical process of the indirect proof. So I wanted to give you an example of this, okay? But you can also be leading your students to be thinking about these things. And I can tell you, they love this stuff. They love starting to think about things and to be challenged, not like they're going to get the wrong answer, but if you can really create an environment where there is a time of day where they get to start just really thinking about things and puzzling over things, especially once they get to the logic level and beyond. They love doing this. So here's the premise. The base of angles of a triangle must be less than 90 degrees. The base angles of a triangle must be less than 90 degrees. That's actually true. Okay, that's absolutely true. But what we do in indirect proof is we suppose the opposite of the truthful statement. Okay, well, if that's what we're trying to prove, let's suppose a triangle's base angles are equal to 90 degrees. And then we do if then. If a triangle's base angles are equal to 90 degrees, then those angles are right angles. Would everybody agree with that? Okay, and you could even have your students kind of draw on their paper. Okay, there's the base angles of the triangle. And of course, they should easily be able to see what the problem is going to be. If those base angles are right angles, then the line segments that form those angles are perpendicular. Would we agree about that? If those line segments are perpendicular, then the sides of the triangle connecting to the base, this one and this one, are parallel, right? But if those sides are parallel, then what happens? They're never gonna meet, and so then the shape will never be a triangle. Therefore, and this is the finish of the indirect proof, what we assumed in the suppose was false, and if this is false, then we have the truth. And actually, we only have half the truth with this one because we'd have to do it one more time, wouldn't we? What would our next indirect proof have to be before we could definitely say this? Greater than, right? Because this isn't an either or thing. Okay, good. All right, good teaching at the rhetoric level. Initial thoughts to keep in mind. The rhetoric level typically begins in 9th or 10th grade, but there's always overlap between the levels of the trivium. Remember what we talked about in philosophy, it's not just about stages of learning. Remember that any new topic or subject matter should begin at the grammar level. Rhetoric is the art of expression. During the rhetoric stage, the student learns to express herself with fluency, grace, elegance, and persuasiveness. That's from Susan Wise Bauer. So our rhetoric level learning tools, and again, we're going to have to fly through them. I'll leave this slide up for just a little bit longer so you can write them down, because if we don't get to some, it would be down here. And then that gives you food for thought to take home with and do more research on. But the basic learning tools that we have are the 5 divisions of rhetoric, forensics, the Progymnasmata, the Great Books, and the Quadrivium. Okay, let's talk about the 5 divisions of rhetoric. The first one is invention. So invention is kind of the art of developing the topic and the theme for which you are going to speak or write about. And it's amazing. I mean, Aristotle has volumes written on just how to come up with the topic and theme. Can you think about, I mean, imagine that. You know, usually what do we do with our students with this one? Okay, I'm gonna give you the topic. Let's work on our thesis right now. You guys have 5 minutes. Come up with your opinion about elephants, or come up with your opinion about abortion, or come up with your opinion about whatever it is, right? No, there's a lot to gathering kind of different ways that you can then, I mean, when they did invention in the classical world, they didn't just pick a topic and have an opinion, right? They basically did almost, if you will, their research, both through things that they knew and also things that they wanted to argue. Okay, they almost kind of made their case all the way to their closing statement in their head beforehand to kind of see, how's this going to work out? what things do I need to dig up first? I mean, it was really kind of a lengthy process just on invention. Some of the things they did were proofs. So you have inartificial proofs, that would be pieces of evidence, and you'd have artificial proofs. Those are appeals, and Dr. Tallman talked about those three appeals in writing an essay with heart, right? Logos, pathos, and ethos. Logos is an appeal to the mind, typically using facts, sometimes pieces of evidence. Okay, evidence can actually cross all three. But logos would be numbers, facts, figures, things that appeal to the mind, that are logical. Pathos is an appeal to the heart and emotions, so some of the evidence would be emotional in nature. Stories or anecdotes or things that would really appeal to our sense of who we are as human beings and our emotions. Ethos is this kind of appeal that isn't to something, but more about someone, namely your audience. Ethos is this idea that I need to be able to somehow understand my audience and have them understand me in a way that they will find me ethical, trustworthy, believable, and so forth. Okay? Credibility is your ethos. So that also needs evidence, but not in a categorical way, but just more in an overwhelming way, right? That you and I have this understanding that you can trust me, that I know what I'm talking about, and that I understand you, and I get where you've been, and so forth. Okay, types of logos. So then we break just one category of the artificial proofs down. So types of logos. You have the deductive, which is those syllogisms, and you have enthymemes, more like kind of inductive, if you will, but still considered deductive, which are probably true. Then you have inductive, which are scientific, all instances, or an example, which would be some instances. So this is all in their kind of like wrapping their minds around the topic itself. Okay, if that weren't enough, you also, Aristotle talked about topoi. Topoi are topics. So what he did was he came up with 28 of them that speakers then could kind of filed away, that they could at any one point in time, they have a topic of virtue. And they kind of know what are the cases. I mean, it's almost like a lawyer's library in their head, or file system, okay, of these different topics. And then 10 that were invalid, that you knew that maybe the person you were arguing against would try to pull, so that you'd already have the counter arguments already. They also had commonplaces. These were kind of like everyday speeches or everyday topics or arguments that they could memorize and then speak upon whenever called to do so. Interesting in the art, I love this part, interesting in the classical rhetoric in the category of invention is something called stasis theory. And stasis theory is something I think we really should teach our junior high and senior high kids, but even maybe beforehand, even when they're younger, to know about. Stasis theory was developed by Hermogenes of Tarsus in 150 BC, so it's been around a long time. And it's the idea of getting in, before you argue, it's the idea about getting an argument in stasis, which means you're going to phrase the debate in terms of one side is pro something and the other side is anti something, whatever that something is. That you kind of massage how you're going to talk about, okay, I am for this, you are against this, whatever this is. And take the abortion argument right now. One of the biggest reasons why in our country we have such kind of, if you will, you kind of see it talking past each other on the topic of abortion, is because the topic is not in stasis. The argument is not in stasis. We are, what would we call ourselves? Pro what? Life. So they're anti-life. We would say yes, but they would say no, we're not anti-life. We're pro-choice. Are we anti-choice? No, we're not anti-choice. We're pro. Do you see how it's not in stasis? We actually can't have, you're not going to have an argument where you can have one side say, wow, you really do make the good case. And where the other side could say, okay, I can consider this now because clearly your body of evidence outweighs my body of evidence. If an argument is not in stasis to begin with, the fact is that you're not going to have either side. You're going to walk away going, we haven't gotten anywhere. All right, how many times, and again, I mean, you have to pare it down. You can't, do this necessarily with 5-year-olds, but how many times if we said, okay, let's go ahead and, especially if it's, back and forth, teacher to student, okay, let's phrase this in a different way. I would like you to do this, and you would like to do something else. Well, can we phrase it in a way I would like to do, and you would not like to do? Or I would, and take it one step at a time. There might be two issues there, right, that you're trying to debate at the same time. It's just an interesting theory that can kind of help to redefine what the argument is so that you can actually come to some conclusion. Okay, arrangement is the second of the 5 divisions of rhetoric. And I'm gonna kind of fly through this. So arrangement is once you've kind of picked your topic and your arguments and you've kind of done your research, right? Arrangement is kind of how, and this was originally set up for oratory. Okay, almost everything was not written, almost everything was spoken in the marketplace and in the forums and in the Senate. So your speech would have this kind of outline, if you will. The Exhordium, you get the audience's attention. We still do that to this day, right? You can probably think about your pastor's sermons, probably follow pretty close to a classical arrangement of rhetoric. Narration, set forth the main parts of the speech. Division, you state the similarities and differences between your case and the opposition. You back up your side, you refute the audience. So it's almost like on one hand you have this, on the other hand you have this. Here's why I'm right. Here's why they're wrong. Okay, that's kind of this one. And then the peroration is a summary. Style. This is one of my favorite things to pull into writing. There are 3 types of style: low, plain, middle, and grand. Cicero also has 4 virtues to analyze style. And my favorite are rhetorical figures. Oh, okay. So you can, several years ago, I actually did something for the CCLE just on rhetorical figures. And a lot of these, I hope you're seeing by now, just any one of these, there's a great body of knowledge of study. And just because it's huge doesn't mean it should be daunting. Just pick one of them. Just kind of learn more about them, because each one has its own nuances and facets. Rhetorical figures are very interesting to me because I think IEW uses dress-ups, right? This is like classical dress-ups, right? With the classical names of things. And so I love showing students, some of them we know. Alliteration is an example of a rhetorical device. Simile and metaphor. But there are so many more out there that you can look up. There are several books out there too that just talk about rhetorical devices for writing and speaking. And so those are great to you can teach them one at a time and slowly enhance your students' writing and speaking using those. Okay, 4th is memorization. 5th is delivery. The first 3 divisions can apply to written and oral communication. Obviously, memorization and delivery would just apply to oral. But typically, if they're memorizing what they've written, you can kind of do both with them. Okay, forensics, the art of public speaking. We actually have gotten through most of this, so I'm very excited about that. I'm just going to kind of put up here. This is forensics and public speaking, speech. There's, again, so much more to it in terms of classical oratory. So classical oratory includes all 5 divisions that we just went through to help develop and deliver speeches. Modern forensics have different categories, and again, this is more for, the high school years, what you would do. It includes interpretation, it includes limited preparation like impromptu speaking, public addresses, and debate. And there are even different styles of debate. Okay, the Progym. The Progymnasmata is attributed to Hermogenes of Tarsus, and is a series of exercises in the division of invention. So that first slide we went through where there's all this stuff about invention, the Greeks and Romans really took that first stage or division of rhetoric as one of the most important. These exercises are first mentioned in the Rhetorica ad Alexandrum, which is a treatise, probably written by one of Alexander's tutors. And these exercises are found in writing curricula at the logic and even grammar levels today. So there are programs with the Progym out there now. And there is also much merit to have students of rhetoric work through them, because I equate it to kind of when all of us first went through the catechism, when it was, you know, like for most of us junior high or maybe a few years earlier, right? We memorized the catechism, we worked through our catechism classes with our pastors. But then if you took a catechism class in college, or if you took a catechism class as an adult, it's the same catechism, right? But don't you get a lot more out of it when you are more advanced in understanding kind of the nuances of it? It's the same thing with the Progym. And they're exercises, you do them in order, and they help you develop your composition and your oratory skills. These are the exercises in order. And again, rather than, take our last 2 minutes up and have you guys try to scribble them down, just look up Progymnasmata and you'll get these in order. Great Books Canon. I know Pastor Kane went over the books you should read. So I just want to highlight these sources for places where you can find book lists. We also at CCLE.org have a great book list too. But pages 494 to 497 of The Well-Trained Mind has a list of great books. 213 to 220 in The Case for Classical Christian Education by Douglas Wilson. 259 to 266 in Who Killed Homer? Although this is just Greek classics, so it's limited, but still great Greek classics to read. And then Wikipedia lists great books of the Western world. They mostly have a good list. The table of contents in the omnibus curriculum, even if you don't, the omnibus curriculum, the downside is it's super expensive and it's huge volumes. And also, while they do they do most of your primary sources, you're getting those separate. And this is just kind of the history and the discussion about what you're reading in the time, literature, history, and philosophy all together. It's a great, and theology, it's a great curriculum, but it's really expensive, and so sometimes it's just not what schools, or especially homeschool educators are going to spend their money on. But what you can do is you can get the table of contents for free. That's online. You can just look up, find the omnibus curriculum, and you can see online the table of contents, and then you can piece it, at least the literature portions, for yourself. So again, instead of trying to buy, this is kind of what Pastor Kane was saying, volumes of expensive curricula, try to find online sources or utilize your local library. There are a lot of times that we can find most of this canon for free. And we are out of time. Let's see, how many slides do I have? Okay, we missed 2 slides. I'm just going to go to the in conclusion. First of all, thank you very much. This was a 3-day journey, and I appreciate you all being here with me. This is the best education for both your students and for you. If one truly understands how much the Trivium has to offer, we could all accept happily the role of perpetuus disciplus, the perpetual student. The keys to good teaching are to be a good student of the Trivium, to plan with an end in mind, to teach with the end in mind, to provide your students with all the fullness and richness the Trivium has to cover, and to give all glory to God. Deo Soli Gloria. So, thank you.